Hey Copper Nerds, time for another unenveloping, and this is going to be another fantastic replica from the Gallery Mint Museum. So as you've probably gathered, I'm down a little bit of a rabbit hole regarding the Gallery Mint Museum. I wish I would have known a little bit more about them a little sooner, but you know, better late than never. This isn't exactly copper related, but I mean, this envelope isn't. That certainly is. That's an S1 chain cent, which would be the very first, the very first copper coin struck by the US Mint, and often erroneously referred to as the first coin struck by the US Mint. What was actually first was the half dime, and you'll hear people call it the half Disme because it's what it looks like it should be pronounced. And you'll hear some people say, oh, it's just pronounced dime. It's dime. I picked that up from Jim Carr. Got it out safely. It's going to go into a capsule. You got to be so careful of flips. If you slide the coin across the surface, you're likely to scratch it. And what you need to do, and I don't know if you could see me doing it, was you need to get this thing to flex a little bit so that when it does slide down, the coin's riding on its rims instead of on the surface of the fields and the devices of the surface of the coin. But here we go. We got the tag, Gallery Mint Museum, 1992. Wow, this is beautifully struck. So we have the very first coin struck by the US Mint, and this is a faithful copy, and you'll see the word copy under the eagle, which looks like a turkey or a chicken or whatever. I might do a little bit of research on this after our intermission. Such a tiny little coin, but this was worth 5 cents back in the day. It is made from silver, and my sons and I were fortunate enough to be able to take a look at the Rittenhouse example of the half dime. Rittenhouse being the first director of the US Mint. So I will go ahead and insert a couple of pictures that I took at the A&A Museum last summer. So before I jump into this article, generally speaking, the half Disme was thought to have been struck off premises in a privately owned building, using equipment that eventually went to the mint, but not struck in the US Mint. That's later been determined to not be completely accurate. The bulk of them were struck in a privately owned facility, but then once the US Mint was built and established, the remaining half dimes that were struck there. Before that, it was often thought that these were all struck off premises and that this Sheldon 1 a Mary chain cent was the first coin to be struck by the US Mint. But that title goes to the half dime according to all sources that I have found that are recent. So let's see what the A&A says here. A more accurate history of the 1792 half dime. First 1,500 coins of the infant United States Mint came off the press in the late 18th century and almost immediately disappeared from view. Centuries after its modest debut, that revolutionary mission, the 1792 half dime, is shrouded in mystery. Was it struck at the Philadelphia Mint or in the cellar of a mint contractor? Was it produced in the summer of 1792 prior to the mint opening or in October later that year after operations began? Were they meant to be patterns? Were they business strikes intended for circulation? Who provided the bullion? Was it President George Washington or someone lesser known? What I believe we're going to read here in a second is that Thomas Jefferson provided the silver to the mint, and that, again, the bulk of them were struck off-site, with the last striking being at the mint, and that all of the half deems were delivered to Thomas Jefferson, and then Jefferson put them all into circulation. So let's see if that's what we read. So I'm just going to provide a few comments as I read through the article. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but here they note that really no one was aware of the striking in 1792. There was no announcement, there was no first strike ceremony, nothing of that nature. So then it says over the first, generation or so after they were struck, people would occasionally encounter these tiny little 5-cent pieces that had the word deem, which looks like it's spelled Disme, and a lot of people call them half Dismes, but I, again, am told with authority that half deem is the correct pronunciation. Apparently, within a few decades of them being struck, the half deem had become an almost mythical coin among numismatists, so had a lot of intrigue early on. The first authoritative source was from April of 1844, where there was a meeting with Adam Eckfeld of the original mint. He had retired 5 years previously, but still had an office at the mint. And he had a guest, John McAllister, and he was a collector. Eckfeld was the closest we got to an original mint employee. He came on in the first few years of the mint. He wasn't there from day one, as I recall. He's the guy that made die steel so much better over his early years in the mint, which is why 1794's had so much die failure compared to the later dies that he worked on. Ultimately, they went from striking up a couple thousand coins per set of dies to a couple 100,000 coins. After interviewing Eckfeld, these are the 6 claims that were made. The half deems were struck expressly for President George Washington. I believe this stuff's all going to be refuted. Washington provided the silver for the striking. Washington's silver was valued at $100. Washington received all $100 worth of half deems, 2,000 total. They were never intended for circulation, were supposed to be distributed as souvenirs, and they were created before the mint was ready to operate, and they were all struck by John Harper in his facilities. Pretty sure we're going to find that none of that is the case. So then come 1860, around the time of the Civil War, the U.S. Mint Director James Snowden, who had, it says, twice recounted the story of Washington and the half deems, wrote 2 books and presented some new information contradicting much of what Eckfeld had relayed through McAllister. So in a book Snowden wrote called A Description of Ancient and Modern Coins, he quoted Voigt, I believe that's Henry Voigt, saying that the coins were made at the U.S. Mint in October of 1792. Jefferson was in charge of organizing the mint. He was who Rittenhouse and Voigt reported to. Jefferson was central in the history of the half deems. Jefferson's records of the half deem were kept in an unexpected place, not in a governmental archive or official publication, but rather in one of his private memorandum books. So, ultimately, the evidence that we are relying on regarding the history of the half deem came from Jefferson's own memorandum books. That book was not published until 1997. He wrote it in 1792. So Jefferson's notes indicate that on July 10th of 1792, he withdrew $100 from the Bank of the United States, probably in the form of Spanish silver dollars, and that the next day he delivered $75 at the mint to be coined. And then he received 1,500 half deems of the new coinage, and that is said to have happened on July 13th of 1792. Jefferson knew that the Mint Act said that citizens could bring in bullion and have them struck, weight for weight, into silver or gold coins. So immediately after Jefferson took delivery of his 1,500 half-deems on Friday, July 13th of 1792, he left Philadelphia with his daughter Maria to spend some summertime at Monticello. I've been there, that place is cool. His estate near Charlottesville, Virginia. On that first day of Jefferson's trip, they went to Chester, Pennsylvania, about 18 miles from Philly. And he recorded tipping servants along the way the amount of 30 cents. Which could have signified the expenditure of 6 half-deems. So that's interesting. The very first people who likely received half-deems in hand were servants of African American descent, likely freed slaves. Apparently, Jefferson spent a lot of the half-deems on his trip to Monticello. It looks like the memorandum book confirms the last claim that the Philadelphia Mint was not in operation on July 11th through 13th of 1792. The property wasn't even approved for purchase until July, that same month, a couple days prior. And the construction of buildings didn't even begin until July 19th. So Jefferson's memorandum book settles every major question surrounding the half-deem save one. What about Snowden's quotation from Voight's first account book stating the half-deems were struck in early October of 1792? Apparently that is unresolved. We have 6 different die states from that one single pair of dies that were used to strike all of the half-deems. There's some die cracks that progress. Voight's book suggests that the coining presses were received in September of 1792, that all had been assembled, dressed, and prepared for trial strikes, operations that were completed by October 9th. The only dies on hand, which would have made the trial strikes, were the 1792 half-deems, and about another 200 to 500 additional examples were struck on October 9th. Wow, I thought I was losing my mind. So, half-deems were first struck at the U.S. Mint just for trial purposes, even though Jefferson had already distributed some $75 worth, or 1,500 of them. And then the first coin that was struck for mass production was the Mary Chain cent. So that's some interesting history. So how about the half-deem? It's a nice little design, and this is a really nice replica. It's fantastic. You know, that eagle on the back sure does look like a turkey or something. And the depiction of liberty is not bad. You know, a little masculine, but it always seems like they were a little masculine on those early, most of our early coinage, honestly. So let's take a closer look at some photos of our Gallery Mint Museum half-deem replica. And with that, I appreciate you checking out this video. Feel free to discuss in the comments. This is kind of an interesting story of what was the first coin struck by the U.S. Mint. And, the half-deem may very well have been first. I do think that the Mary Chain cent was probably the most important, particularly with how much history there is surrounding the large cents, and the fact that they were the first coin really put into circulation for general circulation, rather than, I'd imagine a lot of the half-deems were just kind of kept as souvenirs and not spent in commerce, given that they were mostly handed out by Thomas Jefferson. It's the kind of thing you would hang on to and not just spend, and then by the time a generation or two had passed, they were no longer really circulating coins. So I do think most of them were treated like souvenirs, whereas the large cents, they were definitely spent as money. And with that, I will catch you on the next one. Peace.